All right, let's go ahead and get started. So thanks for joining us today on today's webinar, and thanks to the U.S. Chamber for being able to participate in this. This is a great opportunity for us to hear from some experts from the U.S. Chamber about economic outlook and also employment policy changes, both at the state and federal level. So that and again, this is going to be recorded. So if you know anybody that's that maybe missed it today, you can check it out on our website or also on our podcast. So to kick things off, I'd like to introduce Curtis Dubay. Curtis Dubay is a senior economist in the Economic Policy Division at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He tracks the condition of the economy, analyzes the impact of public policy on economic growth, and runs the Chamber's Chief Economist Committee. Previously, he was senior economist at the American Bankers Association and research fellow in tax and economic policy at the Heritage Foundation. He also worked at the accounting firm PricewaterhouseCoopers and at the Tax Foundation. Dubay has researched and published frequently on a wide range of tax and economic issues. He is regularly quoted by the press and has appeared often in the media, including on CNBC, Fox Business, Fox News, and C-SPAN. He has testified before Congress several times and been cited in newspapers such as the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, and Politico. No wonder you look familiar. Dubay received his master's degree in economics from the University of Connecticut and his bachelor's degree in economics and leadership studies from the University of Richmond. He resides in Washington, D.C. with his wife and 3 sons. Curtis, welcome to San Marcos Chamber, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Really glad to be here. This is actually really timely. So I just got this a new book, and it's about, apparently it's a number one New York Times bestseller. And I was just looking it up. The title is The Greatest Gambling Story Ever Told, a true tale of 3 gamblers, the Kentucky Derby, and the Mexican cartel. And the part I read last night was taking place in Tijuana, and the people involved are driving from LA right through your city and into Tijuana. So timely that I'd be with you today. And it's really engaging so far. If you're into that type of thing, it's a really short book. It's really good. So that has nothing to do with the economy. Let's turn over to the economy. I'll walk you through a bunch of different data points that can really point to what's going on in the economy right now and what's going to be going on in the future. But the thing to keep in mind is that we are on the precipice of a booming economy, something that we haven't seen in many years now. Once we get fully more past the virus, and the way we do that is with more vaccinations. So if vaccinations continue to go as they've been going, and there's some risk that they're now starting to slow down, which would it really is the kind of downside risk in the current forecast. But as long as we keep getting vaccinations going at the current pace, we can start to see the service industries that we've all been prevented from engaging in, things like going to restaurants and bars, going to events, sporting events, theater, business events. We would have been doing this in person. Think about the conventions and conferences that you didn't get to go to over the past year. Those are a major business for the folks that put them on. Think about all the hotels. One of the last things I did before being locked in with my 3 kids for the last 14 months was go to 2 conferences down in Florida. We had our board meeting down in West Palm Beach, and I went there, and then I went up to Orlando to do a conference. And it was one of these big hotels in Orlando, and the group that was putting on was one of the smaller groups there. But there were just like every conference room in this enormous hotel was booked, and this was like as COVID was starting. So I think all those people who haven't been able to work for the last year, it's been a really big impact on the economy. So if we can get vaccines up and get those businesses back on track, we're going to see a really strong economy. And the forecasters that I follow and that we follow and that we build our forecast off of have built that into their estimates. So they're assuming that we get those vaccinations in place and that we get the opening that we need to really get the economy going. And so I'll walk through why there's so much optimism for the rest of the year. I'm going to talk a lot about jobs. The jobs market is very, very interesting right now. If you follow any of that kind of data, I'm sure you're hearing this from your members, and if there's businesses on the call today, I'm sure you're starting to experience it. We have about, I think it's under 10 million now, but it's probably under 9 million, but 9 to 10 million Americans, 9 to 10 million fewer Americans employed than prior to the pandemic. And the unemployment rate is 6%. So it's higher than it was. But we have all these businesses that say they're not able to hire. So that's a really interesting dynamic going on, usual, and I'll get into that as well. The other thing to keep in mind is that we're in a very unusual economic circumstance. We don't usually have these kind of economic pullbacks, recessions that we had. We had, and you'll see a record-breaking recession this time last year. We've had a very strong recovery, and we're on track for a continued strong recovery. But this was a very unique in that usually recessions happen because of something that happens within the economy. Think about the Great Recession, right? We have a financial crisis. It triggers over into the housing market, or the housing market tripped over to the financial sector, whatever way you want to look at it. But then it transferred over to the real economy. We had a very severe recession that lasted for a long time. That's how it usually works, right? You have some kind of imbalance in the economy, a bubble that bursts, and then that impacts other areas of the economy, and it takes some time to work those imbalances out. This is something that's coming from outside the economy. This is a health issue that is imposing its will on the economy. And the way it has done that, and you can see very clearly in the data as we start walking through it, is that when virus levels go down, the economy resurges up, and when virus levels come back up, the economy pulls back. Very unique circumstance. One of the things that we've been very fortunate about is that usually when you have something like this, the big problem is that bubbles get exposed within the economy. And when those bubbles burst, you get spillover effects that I was talking about. That hasn't happened. And that's really very fortunate. And it does speak to the efficacy of the response from both the Federal Reserve and from Congress. I'm not usually a cheerleader for economic policy in Washington, but in this case, it has been exemplary. The Fed has done a really good job protecting the financial sector, and Congress has done a really good job, as you'll see, making sure that families are able to weather the storm as well. And so I'll walk through this as we go forward. But like I said, booming economy, second part of this year, a couple of downside risks to keep in mind. One is that those vaccinations level off, whether it's because of vaccine hesitancy or because we pulled that certain vaccines off the market, or whatever the reason, whatever the cause. If we don't continue to see vaccinations at the level that we've seen, we will not get the booming economy that we are hoping for. The other potential downside risk is inflation. We are likely to see a bout of inflation at levels we haven't seen in a very long time. The Fed wants to allow for inflation to run well above 2%. The terms they use are they want 2%, but they want that to be symmetric and average. In English, that means they're willing to let it, because it's been below 2% for so long, they're willing to let it run well above 2% for a period of time. And that could be, if it gets out of their control, which they're very confident that they can handle it, then that could be certainly a downside risk. And the last one is coming from Washington. If you see the Democratic majority in the Senate abolish the filibuster, you would see a barrage of new economic policies that would take a bite out of economic growth. We can talk more about that in question and answers, but it's certainly something to keep an eye on, and it's certainly a danger that's lingering out there right now. So with that, that's kind of the high-level overview of what's going on right now. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and walk through some charts that really drive home the themes that I have highlighted here so far. And let me know if you are seeing it. You should be seeing it now.
Yes, I can see it. Mm-hmm.
Great. Fantastic. Okay. So the first one here, consumer confidence, consumer sentiment is the one I usually lead with because pretty straightforward. The better consumers feel about the economy, the more they're willing to spend. The more they're spending, the better business they're doing, and it's kind of a virtuous cycle. This one's really interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that we were at almost, I think it was pretty much record high levels back before the pandemic. Of course, the pandemic hits in March and April, and consumer confidence falls pretty sharply. The thing is, if you look at the bounces, those really tie. I was talking about the rise in virus levels and then in the fall. So you had really strong high virus levels in March and April and May. Consumer sentiment really fell off. They started to drop in May and June, and consumer sentiment picked up. Then we got a surge in late June and July I think it was the South and the West back then, and consumer sentiment fell. The levels started falling in August and September, and things are looking good. We're turning a corner into October. Then we get the rise in late October, November, December, falls off. I think it continues to fall off into January. But then now, as vaccinations kick in and another round of checks, we're now seeing a 2-month increase, and we're now at the highest level during the pandemic. And I would assume that this will continue to rise as we go forward. Again, the stimulus checks really do help, the return to work, the increase in vaccinations, and consumers are feeling pretty good. What's interesting about this as well is I alluded to the inflation issue, and I did we did an event for our economic committee with the vice chair of the Federal Reserve, Richard Clarida, and I said to him, so I just turned 40, and I said to him, Mr. Clarida, I've never lived through a period of prolonged inflation or very high inflation. So you have a whole generation of people, a couple generations of people who have never dealt with this. Are you prepared for this? That if we get really high levels of inflation, that you can handle it, and that you'll be keep it under control. And he's very confident that the Fed has the tools to do that. But what I thought was interesting, why I brought up that it's been a very long time since we've had pretty strong inflation, is that consumers are picking up this report from the University of Michigan. That's like the number one thing that consumers are concerned about, and it's for a whole. It's got to be a huge chunk of the population who has never dealt with inflation to be sensing that it could be an issue is really something, and that they're picking up on the big fiscal stimulus from Congress, the several $1 trillion, and then the Federal Reserve's actions on the monetary side. It's just interesting to me that consumers are savvy enough to understand that could be an issue as we go forward. This is consumer sentiment is made up of two things: current what they feel about the economy right now, and what they feel it'll be in 6 months. Both are improving. They move again in lockstep with the virus, and usually move together. It's interesting that the current feelings are increased more than future expectations. I don't know what's going on there. You would think at this point that with vaccinations rising and with the prospects for the economy being pretty good, that future expectations would be shooting up. They might this month. Something to keep an eye on. Maybe consumers are seeing something that we're not seeing from our vantage point. Unemployment claims came out today. They are now below 600,000. They were been for a long time, well too long, stubbornly over 1 million. Now they're finally getting down to a more reasonable number. Before the pandemic hit, we were looking at like 250,000 claims a week. We're still at 550,000 last week. That came out today. So it's still like double what we would normally expect. The thing is with this data is it's irretrievably broken, because there's been so many. The system got overwhelmed with claims. There's been a huge issue with fraud, and there's just the states can't unbury themselves from what they got hit with. So the thing to do is not to look at the absolute number anymore, but to look at the trend, and it's coming down steadily. In the last couple of weeks, it's really finally dipped lower consistently. So that's really good. That's really good news on the initial claim side. The one I really look at, though, is this one, which is continuing claims. That's the number of people who have filed for claims minus those who are no longer claiming benefits. And that means, hopefully that means because they're going back to work. Now, they might have exhausted their benefits, but for the most part, it's people who are going back to work. And that has been falling steadily for weeks now. So it's very clear that the labor market is improving and getting better. And you can see that in the monthly jobs claim. Or the monthly jobs numbers. So we can't follow we only get the big labor market numbers once a month. That's why everyone kind of follows the weekly claims, because they should track. But we got the monthly jobs numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and we added almost 1 million jobs. It actually was over 1 million when you take into account the revisions for the prior couple months. So we had a very strong month in March, and we are still, I forget the total number here, but we're still well below where we were prior to the pandemic. I think it's over 8 million fewer jobs. There's lots of different ways to look at the labor market, but the thing to keep in mind is that the unemployment rate is down to 6%. It's going to keep coming down. We'll probably get back close to where we were prior to the pandemic, which was like 3%, I think it was. It was really, really low. We're going to have a pretty reasonable unemployment rate by the end of the year. 6% is pretty reasonable given what we're going through right now. But there's still going to be a lot fewer jobs in the economy than there were prior to the pandemic, because so many people have left the labor force. And so definitely look at both of those factors. And then we need to think through how we can get people back to work, because again, like I alluded to, businesses are trying to hire like crazy. Now, government benefits are very lucrative right now, so that's keeping some people out. That's only part of the story. The other part is my 3 kids are home. They've been home for 14 months. People have had to leave the workforce to care for loved ones, and then you have people who are unwilling to work because they don't want to expose themselves to the virus. Some of those things will work themselves out naturally. As people get vaccinated, they're going to be more willing to go back to work. As the virus levels decline, schools hopefully open up. That'd be really very, very helpful if DC would open their schools, and government benefits are going to start to expire. I don't think there's going to be another round of stimulus checks. The unemployment benefits are going to be around for a little while longer, but they're not quite as lucrative as they were back, say, this time last year. It was a $600 extra per week from the federal government. I think it's $300 extra per week now. And as those benefits decline, there'll be a better move into the labor market. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is that there is a mismatch of workers and jobs that existed before the pandemic and exists in a bigger way now. And that's a skills mismatch and a regional mismatch. So what I mean by that is that the job openings that we have now, the workers that are available don't necessarily have the skills to fill those positions. So it's not like we can just say, because it's roughly in parity now. We have 9 million job openings and 9 million people unemployed. If we get match those things up, everything will be taken care of. That's not how it's going to work because of that skills mismatch. And of course, those people aren't in the places where the jobs are necessarily open. It's something that the chamber is going to be working on increasingly as we going forward, because it was going to be an issue prior to the pandemic. It's going to be an issue as we go forward. A lot of the issues with automation is wrapped up with this, and it's going to be something that we're going to be dealing with for the foreseeable future after we get past COVID-19. Couple quick things before. I don't want to take a step on Glenn's time, and I want to leave plenty of time for question and answers. As I said, we had a record contraction back in the second quarter of last year. The previous record for quarterly contraction was 10% in 1958 for one quarter. That was because of, interestingly, the flu pandemic that year. So we beat that by threefold. The economy contracted by over 31% in the second quarter of last year. Keep in mind, these are what's called annualized numbers. So it's basically the size of the quarterly contraction multiplied by 4. So it's like 9.5% from one quarter to the other. It's just how they're reported, the annualized number. So we dropped by 31%. We didn't lose a third of the economy, as I'm trying to get at, but dropped 31% in the second quarter. We increased by 32% in the third quarter. Really good bounce back. Really shows the resiliency and the strength of the U.S. economy. The previous record expansion was over 17% in 1950, so we beat that by twofold, and so that was really good. We tailed off a little bit in the fourth quarter, down to 4% because of the resurgence of the virus. But going forward, we're looking at really strong growth. I think we're probably going to be over 6% in the first quarter. That we'll find that out next Thursday. We're looking at 8% growth in the second quarter, 7% in the third quarter, and then still pretty strong growth in the fourth quarter. And that's going to continue into 2022 as well. And again, this is all the things that I said about vaccinations being the estimates are that we get fully vaccinated and get to herd immunity and get back to those services are built into this forecast. So hopefully we do get people vaccinated so we can see growth at these levels. I should point out that when I said we dropped by 31% in the second quarter and then grew by 32% in the third quarter last year, if you do the math, it doesn't work that when you drop 31% and then grow by a greater percent the next quarter that you get back to where you were. You have to grow by a lot more to get back to the same absolute size. We're probably just now getting back to the size economy we had prior to the pandemic. So the pandemic didn't start. I mean, the recession didn't start until the last 2 weeks of March, the very end of the first quarter of 2021. That's when shutdowns began and the economy fell off a cliff. And we're probably just hitting that size of the economy in the last couple of weeks. So it took about a year from the beginning of the recession till we got back to the size economy we had before. And interestingly, I also calculated how long will it take us to get back to the size economy we would have had if we never had the pandemic. So if we just kept growing as we were, we never had the enormous hiccup that we had with the pandemic. And it's actually later this year. It's an incredibly quick recovery. So like a year and a half to get back to where we would have been. And getting back to the size economy we had before in only a year is twice as fast as during the Great Recession. So this has been a very strong recovery. And again, it has a lot to do with the monetary response from the Fed and the fiscal stimulus from Congress has really helped. And the strength of the U.S. economy. We were in really good shape prior to the pandemic. And because there were none of those bubbles I talked about that burst, we're in this situation right now. And again, really in a historically strong recovery. Now, even though we're going to get back to where we were, and then we'll get back to roughly the size economy we would have had if we never had the recession, we still lost that growth in those quarters where we were below where we were. It's going to take a while to work back from that. To get that back, we have to grow above where we would have been growing to get the lost growth back. But still, this is a really good story and something we should feel very fortunate about. And this is unusual on the global scale. We are definitely the best in the world right now when it comes to the economy. The last two things I just want to hit on because really drive home. So usually when you have a big recession, incomes fall because people are out of work and businesses aren't earning. Because sales drop. Income is now over 4% higher than it was pre-pandemic. And that's all because of government support and the relatively strong recovery. So people have gone back to work and kept earning. A lot of people stayed working, and so their incomes have remained steady. And then you have people who lost work and went back to work. And then you have the government support, both the stimulus checks and the extra unemployment benefits. So very unusual circumstance where you have income higher than pre-pandemic when the economy was in really good shape. And this has been persistent for a while. And this is going to be much higher. We'll get this data next Friday. And this is going to go higher than it was in January because the January spike was because of the $600 checks. These were $1,400 checks. So this is going to be a heck of a lot of money coming into income for next month. That'll probably be a record high and probably be the biggest increase we've ever seen in a 1 month snapshot. And the last thing I want to share is that so the thing about pandemics is that it limits the amount of money you can spend because there's just fewer things to spend it on. Because of that, we've seen a record high run up in savings. Since March of last year, in aggregate, Americans have saved about $3 trillion. Not a misspeak, $3 trillion. That's $2 trillion over trend. So that's $2 trillion more than they would have spent. So this is the other factor, other than getting to go do those services that we haven't been able to do. The Americans have money to spend on these items, sitting in their bank accounts, waiting to spend. It's been accumulating for over a year now, and they are going to be using that money to spend in a big way if the virus levels come down and they're able to. I'm gonna stop there. I could go on for a lot longer, but please let's turn to question and answers. I'm happy to answer questions about anything I touched on today or anything that I didn't get to that you'd like to hear about. Thanks.
Thanks, Curtis. Any questions for Curtis?
A quick question. So my husband owns a small business, and I know many of our members are small business owners, and we're not paying the wages that we're paying the lower level wages. And so the comment that you made about, why do we still have all these millions of people who aren't working? One of the theories is that we have a lot of the stimulus money in the marketplace, right? And, for lack of a better description, maybe these people don't want to come to work quite yet because they're making more money not working than they would, say, at a small business type job. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think that's part of it. Like I said, I think there's three factors. I think there's a lot of people who cannot get out of the house because they're caring for loved ones who are, like I said, I've been stuck home for 14 months with 3 kids in the house. So even we're not, the chamber really, the building isn't fully open. But even if it was, I couldn't go. Right. And luckily my wife and I are both able to work remotely. So we haven't, neither one of us has had to leave the labor force. But if that wasn't the case, one of us would have had to leave. And I think a lot of people are in that exact situation. So you have that group
finding
that
that with our students as well. Yeah.
Right. So if you got a kid at home and they can't go there, there's nowhere to go. If daycares are closed and schools are closed, and you don't want your elderly relatives to care for them because the virus hits they're the most at risk, you're stuck.
Right.
So that's one group. The other group is those who are hesitant to work because they don't want to contract the virus, and they feel at risk. That's probably a smaller group. But then you have the others who are done the calculation, and it doesn't make sense to go back to work when you're receiving those government benefits. Like I said, I think that will work itself out because those benefits are running out. Glenn might have I can't remember off the top of my head when the unemployment benefits run out, the plus up from the federal level, but that will run out eventually, and then they have to make a choice, right? Do they go into the labor force because that will be their only way of earning at that point. And then the last thing is the skills mismatch that I hit on.
Yeah.
Curtis, I have a question about the tourism industry because it's so critical in San Diego County, and it's great to hear all these positive things. But at what point do you think people are going to start feeling more comfortable and things are going to start moving forward from a hospitality standpoint and tourism standpoint?
I think we're close. I think that once people are vaccinated, and I think the messaging on vaccinations has to change for that to really take off, though, right? So the messaging is really muddled. You have people who feel as though if they're vaccinated, that they can go on and live their lives. And then you have others who feel like, well, I might still be able to get sick. I might still be able to pass it. So nothing's going to change. I think the evidence is pretty clear that vaccinations mean you should go live your life. But until that is broadly accepted, it's going to be an issue for tourism. And that messaging is coming from folks here in Washington, and it's not unless that changes, it's gonna hold it back a little bit. But anecdotally, I do think that tourism, those who just are going to say, "Hey, I'm vaccinated, I'm ready to go," just anecdotally, we're trying to book a place for vacation this summer and can't even book one. Prices are through the roof, and demand is way up. And I think my wife was actually pretty astute by pointing out that you have a huge number of people who would have traveled internationally who are not going to be able to travel internationally. So that's putting increasing demand domestically, and I think that is true. But I think you will see a surge once the vaccination levels go up, levels come down, and then the messaging changes on vaccinations. Once you're vaccinated, once the message from Washington and public health experts is, "Oh yeah, you're vaccinated, go ahead and travel." I think that's when the takeoff really occurs. And you can see the appetite for it. I don't know if you're watching baseball or basketball or hockey. I've been watching those kind of a little bit here and there, but the crowds are pretty strong at baseball games to the extent that they're letting people in. And same with hockey, and then indoor hockey and basketball. The demand is there. Those are in my mind the tourism and the athletic events are tied when it comes to demand. You don't have to travel necessarily for a sporting event, but it's the same type. It's entertainment.
Great, thank you. And let's go ahead and shift over. I want to introduce Glenn. Curtis, thanks again for taking the time and sharing all that information with us. And it's good to we're seeing the positive news, but hearing it as well is great to hear. So thank you.
Thanks for having me. If you want the slide deck, just let me know. I'll send it over.
Okay, thank you. Okay, now I'd like to introduce Glenn Spencer. Glenn is the Senior Vice President of the Employment Policy Division, which represents the interests of the employer community across a range of labor and employment issues. The division works to ensure that laws and regulations affecting employers are developed with employer concerns acknowledged and are fairly applied. It also provides businesses with guidance and expertise on legislative and regulatory matters. Before joining the Chamber in July 2007, Spencer spent nearly 6 years at the U.S. Department of Labor in the Office of Secretary, serving as the Deputy Chief of Staff and then Chief of Staff to Secretary of Labor Elaine Chao. Earlier in his career, Spencer was engaged in issue advocacy and grassroots lobbying for Citizens for a Sound Economy in Washington, D.C., and also worked as a senior analyst in the research departments of the National Republican Senatorial Committee and the Republican National Committee. Spencer's articles have been published in numerous leading newspapers, and he has appeared on nationally syndicated radio and television news programs, holds a MA in International Affairs from the George Washington University. Glenn, thanks so much for joining us at the San Marcos Chamber today.
Yep, happy to be here, and thanks for the intro, Rick. Just wanted to pick up on two things that Curtis ended with there. Anecdotally, on the travel front, last month, my family decided to throw caution to the wind a little bit and flew out west to go skiing. I'll tell you, the planes were full. Like, there are people traveling. The flight home, there was not a single seat left on the airplane. So that gives you some indication of how things are picking up. Second point Curtis made about the unemployment benefits. So the the federal top up for UI benefits, that $300 per week, that will expire in September. We don't know if that will be renewed. Democrats in Congress may decide that they want to continue some of those supplements. We'll see how that plays out. But the program, as it's written right now, will expire in September. What will expire along with it is a program called Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, which you may have heard about or read about. This is the system of UI benefits for independent contractors. That will also expire. So, yeah, you may see a lot more of those individuals get back into work at that time. We'll see. And again, they may get extended too. Wanted to get into a couple of legislative issues and then some of the regulatory issues. There's a whole range of things we could get into, but in 15 minutes, we'll just kind of stay with what the hot topics are right now, what we see actually in play at the moment. Legislatively, there's two issues. One is a bill called the PRO Act, and then the other is a bill called the Paycheck Fairness Act. The PRO Act is a sweeping rewrite of the National Labor Relations Act. This is the labor union's priority number 1, 2, and 3 bill right now. It would make some substantial changes to the National Labor Relations Act, all in an effort to, one, make it easier for unions to run organizing campaigns, and two, make it much more difficult for employers to have any kind of response to that campaign. So a couple highlights or lowlights, depending on your point of view of that bill. First off, it would undermine the system of private ballot elections that we have right now. Currently, if a union wishes to organize a workplace, they will go in, they will solicit workers. Once they have enough support, they will ask the federal government to come in and hold an election. And that election is typically going to be done by secret ballot. Under this bill, you could still go through that process, but if the union were to lose the election, they could then petition the government with a claim that the employer had somehow interfered in the election process, and then the government could order a rerun election, but this time done just via signature cards. So you wouldn't have to do a secret ballot anymore. The union would just simply be able to go around and solicit signatures, and once they had a majority of the workplace who had put their signature on the card, that would be it. There'd be no election. They would then be certified. One of the complaints that unions have under current law is sometimes if they win an election, it's difficult for them to negotiate a first contract. Now, that's not surprising. First contracts are hard to do just by their very nature. So under the PRO Act, what would happen is if you as the employer did not reach an agreement with that union within 90 days, they could call for an arbitration process, which would mean a group of individuals designated by the union and the employer would be empowered by the government to mandate a first contract for you. And that could work out well. It could also work out that you get stuck with a contract that is not something you can afford. These three individuals may know very little about your business, but they would be the ones who would dictate what your contract would be. Other provisions of this bill, all of you, I'm sure by this point, are familiar with AB 5 in California. That's the law dealing with independent contractors. I would argue it's been less than successful. Others may have different points of view on that. But what the PRO Act does is it takes that AB 5 language regarding the ABC test for contractors and applies it to all 50 states for purposes of labor law. So all of those independent contractors around the country would now be eligible to unionize. And you can forget about Prop 22. That wouldn't really matter in this context. All of those workers covered by Prop 22 would also be eligible to unionize because they'd be considered employees for purposes of federal labor law. Now, just to be clear, this does not cover wage hour issues, overtime, minimum wage, those sorts of things. It is purely for purposes of union organizing. But what it does mean is if, let's say, a union wished to organize Lyft or Instacart or any of these companies, all of those workers would be pulled into the bargaining unit, and their hours and rates of pay would all be subject to negotiations under a union contract. So the unions try to downplay the significance of this provision by claiming, oh, no, it only applies to someone if they want to join a union. But that's not how labor law works. Once you get a majority of people in the bargaining unit to vote for the union, everybody is covered. And you would then lose the ability to pick your own hours, set your own terms and conditions of employment. So all of those things that make you an independent contractor would be lost under that contract. So it is a pretty big deal. The other thing to note about that independent contractor language is that, as you all know, under AB 5, there's probably 100 or so exemptions, because AB 5's ABC test was a very blunt instrument. And it brought in all kinds of individuals that the assembly and the state legislature didn't really mean to cover. So they had to write in 100 or so exemptions. None of those exemptions are in the PRO Act. So every single person that thinks they got a carve out from AB 5 would be covered under the PRO Act. Another provision of this law is that it puts in place a very broad test for what is referred to as joint employment. Joint employment can arise in a number of different industries, franchising in particular, but also if you're an employer that's got subcontracts, you could, in theory, wind up being considered the employer of those subcontractors, of their employees, right? So you've got, let's say you hired a separate company to do your IT services. In a joint employment context, you would actually be the employer of those IT workers. Now, the current rules around joint employment are pretty clear. They require you to really exercise a substantial element of control over those workers, not just merely incidental stuff or things that you might put into a typical contract. Under the PRO Act, that standard becomes much looser. So indirect control can be used to determine whether you're a joint employer. Contractual elements that you reserve, but even if you never exercise, can be used as demonstrations of control. So for example, let's say you do a subcontract with landscaping company or security services. A lot of businesses will do that. Under that contract, you are probably going to reserve certain elements of control, such as let's say one of those workers for the subcontractor makes threats at the workplace or shows up drunk or brings a weapon. You're going to demand that individual be sent off the workplace immediately. Doing so, however, impacts terms and conditions of employment because you have reserved that control for yourself. Being able to show up to work is a pretty key term and condition of employment. So under the PRO Act, that sort of activity could potentially result in a joint employer finding. You would then be determined to be the employer of those subcontractors' employees. In the franchise industry, it's not hard to see how this would work. A large franchisor, say McDonald's, they've got their corporate office in Illinois. They franchise out the name. They don't actually run or employ any of the people at all those McDonald's you see all over the country. 80% of those restaurants are franchised. Under the PRO Act's joint employer standard, all of those restaurants, all the people that work at those franchise restaurants could be determined to be employed by McDonald's corporate. And the reason unions want to do that is because then they can organize the whole company at once. They don't have to go location by location all around the country. So it's great for the unions, not so good for the franchise business because it really undermines the entire model of how that works. Just a couple other quick provisions on the PRO Act I'll mention. One is that it would require you as an employer to turn over to union organizers a whole lot of information about your workers. Things like their home addresses, home phone numbers, personal cell phone numbers, personal email addresses, shift locations, work schedules, all those types of things. So if a union did come to organize your workplace, you'd have about 2 days to put that list together and turn it over. At which point, obviously, workers are going to start getting phone calls and emails and everything else. They're going to wonder how this information got into the hands of the union, and they're going to find out that it was you that turned it over to them. And they're not going to be very happy about that. They're not going to be mad at the union. They're not going to be mad at the federal government. They're going to be mad at you for turning it over. So certainly not a good position for employers to be in. Whenever I raise this provision, the first question that gets asked is, well, couldn't an employee just opt out of this and say, no, I don't want my personal information turned over. It's important to me to keep that private. The answer is no. There's no opt-out provision of any kind for a worker to say that they don't want their information turned over. The last provision of the PRO Act I'll mention is an issue called secondary boycotts. Most people are not familiar with that concept, and that's hardly surprising because secondary boycotts have been illegal since 1947. Congress made them illegal because they had an incredibly disruptive impact on commerce. And so they've been outlawed for, 53? I'm no math major, but it's about 73 years or so. They've been against the law. The PRO Act would legalize that activity. So what that means for an employer is, let's say, most of you I think are probably small businesses. You work with larger employers. Well, let's say, the factory down the street or the hospital up the road is the target of a union organizing campaign. Under current law, the union could do all the pickets and protests and things that they do at that employer that they're actually targeting for the organizing campaign. They can't go downstream and disrupt the business of other employers. Under the PRO Act, they could. They could say, okay, our strategy to make this hospital negotiate is we're going to cut off their financing. We're going to cut off their insurance. We're going to cut off their suppliers. We're going to cut off the people who deliver medicines and take medical samples to and from the hospital. So any of those businesses that do those things, that's who we're targeting. And it effectively would make the hospital unable to function, or it would make all those other companies go to the hospital and say, you know what, you need to just unionize because this is ruining my business. So you need to just give in to the union. And that's the whole objective here. So just make it much easier for unions to have a bigger economic impact when they engage in organizing activity. For smaller employers, for employers who are subcontractors or do work with one of these larger targets, it's a much bigger problem. You really would have no ability, short of telling the company to give in, to get rid of this type of secondary activity, and it could paralyze your business. So very concerning. And again, that activity has been illegal for 70 some odd years now. Where the PRO Act stands right now, it has passed the House of Representatives. It has been sent over to the Senate. There are currently 47 Democrats on board with the PRO Act, no Republicans at this point. I don't anticipate any Republicans will sign on. So as long as two things stay in place, we're okay. One is if we keep the filibuster in place in the Senate, Democrats are not going to find 10 Republicans to vote for this thing. So as long as that stays intact, we're okay. Secondarily, if we can keep those 3 other Senate Democrats off the bill, then even in a post-filibuster world, the bill still couldn't pass. Now, those 3 Democrats are Senators Sinema and Kelly in Arizona. So I know this is California, but if you've got any relationships or ties to those 2 senators in Arizona, this would be a good time to thank them for staying off of that bill. The last senator who's not signed on is Senator Warner from Virginia. That's my home state. He is not going to be the last person standing in front of this thing. So Arizona is really the key. So if you've got any relationships with those Senate offices in Arizona, again, this would be a good time to say thank you to them for staying off of the bill. Okay, that's the PRO Act. Next bill I want to talk about is the Paycheck Fairness Act, and we can cover this fairly quickly. This is a bill that sounds really good on the surface, but when you dig into it, gets a little more problematic. It essentially deals with disparities in pay between men and women, and comes from the concept that 2 people doing the same job ought to be paid the same amount of money, which is a principle I think everybody would agree with. It sounds great. The deeper you dig, though, it starts to get a little concerning. There are pay disparities in the workplace, and frequently those are caused by things like different levels of education, different years of experience, different amount of time at the employer. There's a number of factors that can play into why there is a pay disparity. Now, employers need to be able to discuss that and justify it if they are sued for a discrimination claim. But under this bill, what happens is the only way you can justify any pay disparity is if without that pay disparity, the business would cease to function. That would now be the only legal defense you as an employer would have for why two different people are getting paid different rates. So, the chamber, we agree with the idea that people ought to be paid the same if they're doing the same thing and have the same backgrounds and experience. But this bill removes any real legal defense that an employer would have for those legitimate differentials in pay. So it's very concerning to us. This bill, again, has passed the House, sent over to the Senate. It's been calendared, but I don't know exactly when it will come up for a vote. This is one of the bills that we're referring to as filibuster bait. There is a concerted effort by House Democrats right now to send over bills that they know Republicans in the Senate aren't going to pass. And the idea is to just keep building up this stack of legislation that's gone through the House and gets over the Senate and nothing happens. And they want to use that as the argument for, well, you see, we do need to get rid of the filibuster because the Senate Republicans won't let us do anything. They won't let us pass any bills. But the bills they're sending over are ones that they know don't have bipartisan support. It can't pass. And the Paycheck Fairness Act is one of those. So as we think about the PRO Act, we need to keep in mind some of these other bills that are coming over that are being used in a deliberate effort to make it look like the filibuster needs to be revoked. Currently, we have two senators, Senator Manchin from West Virginia, Senator Sinema from Arizona, again, who have said publicly they are not interested in getting rid of the filibuster at all. That's great for right now, but their patience is not infinite. So as we see more of these types of bills come over, that pressure is going to start to build. So we'll see where this vote goes. I'd imagine Republicans will probably filibuster the Paycheck Fairness Act. It's important for people to know why they're doing that and what's in the bill, and that even though it sounds like a great idea, the fact that it essentially eviscerates employer legal defenses is why groups like the U.S. Chamber and Senate Republicans are opposed to that bill, which, again, on the surface, you would think it sounds like a great bill. Those are the two kind of hot legislative items at the moment. There will be more. But in the interest of time, let's move on to some of the regulatory issues. And there are really three big ones at the Department of Labor right now. One deals, again, with independent contracting. The Trump administration had put into place a rule that we felt was well-grounded in the law and pretty balanced in terms of determining who's an employee versus an independent contractor. The current Department of Labor has pulled that rule back. They are in the process of eliminating it through their own rulemaking. We don't know what they intend to replace it with. Certainly, we know the administration has talked a lot about the California-style ABC test. They think that is probably the preferred way to go. Whether they can do that under a rulemaking in the Fair Labor Standards Act is still open to question. But suffice to say, they will make it more difficult to retain an independent contractor determination through whatever type of regulatory activity they do, whether it's guidance documents or rulemaking or whatever it is. So expect to see that coming sometime over the next 6 to 8 months. In addition, we talked about joint employment already. There was a Trump era rule to provide a clear definition of joint employment and to make it more difficult to find a joint employer determination. Again, the department has pulled that rule back. What they intend to replace it with, we don't know, but I suspect it will look a lot like what the Obama administration did, which again will rely on that indirect control that you might exercise or the contractual control that you reserve for yourself as someone who has a subcontract. So we don't know the timing on that, but it's in the works now. And so sometime in the next 6 to 8 months, I suspect we'll see some kind of proposal come out of the Department of Labor with regard to how they view independent contracting. Third regulatory issue at the Department of Labor regards OSHA and an emergency temporary standard around COVID. We have gotten some encouraging news that the department was expected to issue a rule on this by March 15th. They have pulled that back in large part because of the vaccination campaign, the fact that caseloads are down. And OSHA has pretty strict standards around when they can issue an emergency declaration. There has to be the potential for grave harm in the workplace that is imminent, those sorts of things. It's getting harder to argue that that's the case just because of the pace of vaccinations and the caseloads and that kind of thing. Doesn't mean they won't issue anything. We were fearful they might follow what California did, which I'm sure you are all familiar with in terms of Cal OSHA and their standard. I'm starting to feel optimistic the federal government won't go down that road as well, which would certainly be a welcome development. So we'll see how that plays out. But that is still a live issue at the moment. Let me look back at my notes for one last thing. Overtime. Yes, this is a little bit of a slower burn kind of issue, but has the potential to be very impactful for employers, especially smaller businesses. In the Obama administration, they attempted to change the threshold, the salary threshold for when someone would be considered exempt from overtime and when they would qualify for overtime. Now, initially, they raised that salary threshold very high. So someone making almost $50,000 a year would no longer be exempt from overtime. So they would be eligible for overtime rates of pay. That rule that the Obama administration did got struck down. The Trump administration put in a more reasonable standard where they set it at $35,000. So under the Trump era rule, anyone earning less than $35,000 a year was pretty much going to be eligible for overtime. If you were making more than that, you probably weren't, but it would have some dependence on what you actually were doing in the workplace. So 35,000 was sort of a helpful rule of thumb, just as an employer to know, okay, if you're below that line, probably going to be eligible. If you're above that line, you're probably exempt. We do expect the Obama administration to issue a new overtime rule at some point. They haven't said publicly, what their timing might be, and we're speculating as to what would go in there. But we do think they will raise the salary threshold again, probably putting it back towards that $50,000 level. So anyone earning below that will likely to be eligible. The other thing we think they will probably do is revisit the so-called duties tests. So there's a couple of different things you look at to determine someone's overtime eligibility. It's partly a function of salary, but it's also a function of what they actually are doing. Are they performing activities that are exempt? And there are some definitions around what that would be. I believe under California law, you have the sort of 80-20 standard. So if you wind up doing more than less than 80% of your time is spent on non-exempt activities, you lose the exemption. I think I'm getting that right. So the federal government is going to, we think they will import that into federal rulemaking, so that yes, if you're performing more than a certain percentage of non-exempt duties, let me make sure I got that right. This is a very confusing subject, as you can tell. So if you're performing activities that would cause you to lose the exemption more than 20% of the time, yes, then you lose the exemption, you wind up being eligible for overtime. So you are kind of already living that world, but we do think the federal government is going to bring that into place for all 50 states. We'll see how that rulemaking goes. Last thing they might do here is put in place an inflation adjustment so that every year that salary threshold would go up. We don't think that's legal. The statute does not call for inflation increases every year, but we think that they may go down that road with the rulemaking. So yeah, it might be 50,000 next year, then the year after that, whatever the consumer price index is going to keep ratcheting upwards. But the way they designed it under the Obama administration, it ratcheted up very quickly. So sure, they would have started at 47. Within 10 years, it would have been like up at 70, just because of the way that they defined that inflation adjustment. Trust me, we will fight that pretty hard, including litigation, if they attempt to put that into their rulemaking. Those are just a couple of quick highlights on some of the things that are happening now, a couple of things that we see coming. There's a lot more we could get into, but it's already just about 1 o'clock our time, which I think is when we wanted to wrap this up. So in the interest of time, I'll stop there and see if there's any quick questions I can answer about these topics or anything else.
Thanks, thanks, Glenn. Any questions for Glenn?
Glenn, I had just a question on that that first PRO Act. I guess, that you were discussing. Can you give us any history on how that came about and maybe who brought that forward?
Sure. This was introduced a couple of years ago. The bill sponsor is Senator Patty Murray from Washington State, but she had support from a lot of other people in the caucus. Bernie Sanders in particular was pretty active on this issue. On the Senate side, it's Bobby Scott, who's a congressman from Virginia, and a whole raft of other individuals. But the unions have been pushing this bill for several years now, and it's just this year they've gotten enough critical mass to really make it kind of a hot issue. I mean, last year we were talking a lot about this too, but with the presidency in Trump's hands and the Senate being, having a more Republican majority, we knew that it wasn't going to go anywhere. That's obviously very different this year. It's much more of a live fire exercise. But again, as long as that filibuster is maintained, this bill cannot get out of the Senate. But we think our job is to make sure that even in a world without the filibuster, they don't have 50 votes, because there are still a couple of Democrats who realize how harmful this would be. So again, I'll emphasize here, Arizona is kind of the key. So if you've got relationships with those two senators, this would be a good time to deploy those.
Thanks, Glenn. Any other questions for Glenn? All right, well, I think we're at that time. Glenn, thanks so much for taking some time and updating us on everything that's going on. Also, thanks to you and Jocelyn and everybody on the U.S. Chamber team for everything that you guys do to help the small businesses and help the local chambers get information out to our members and to our local businesses. So we appreciate everything that you guys do.
Happy to do it. And once we do start doing some more widespread travel with the chamber, California's a nice place to visit. So
it certainly is. And thanks everybody for joining the webinar today. We appreciate it. Appreciate you being active chamber members, and everybody have a great day.